Thank you. Can you hear me? Is it? No? Now? I feel as I'm about to announce the result of the general election, actually, standing here, because this is what I normally see on the other side. I was half hoping, in fact, that Julian would call me this morning and ask me to step down and give way to a certain Garcia Margallo, who I gather likes breakfast talks, but otherwise I'm here to speak to you. The year of '88 was a huge year for me professionally and for Gibraltar. And what I want to talk to you about is 1988, about what I would call the end of the colonial state of mind. Because we often talk about self-determination, and I often say to people, you don't ask for self-determination. We have it. It's a question of how we assert it and how brave we are about it. And through my talk, and I gather that the faster I go, the less likely I am to go through a traffic light. Through my talk, what I want to do is pay a little tribute to one particular person who I think is often forgotten in that whole movement, and I think he was actually pivotal. When we started that year, you look at several different events. One of the big events, actually, before getting to the sort of huge ones, was Barlow Clowes. Barlow Clowes was a 133 million fraud case which linked a company into Gib. And what Barlow Clowes did, it set off the House of Commons, well, the National Audit Office did a report, set off the Commons to look at it and say to themselves, actually, finance centres, all these little exotic territories we have abroad could actually become a big problem for us financially. And the word at the time was contingent liability. So you just come out of the closure of the dockyard, the whole business of the Brussels talks in Spain and all that movement. It was clear that there was pressure to use that economic drop to push us towards a more friendly, let's think of other words, relationship with Spain. And I think the financial issue was critical. It was critical because we were about to get a chief minister who was actually going to have to run the economy. Prior to '84, and in that era, the MOD accounted for 70% of our economy. That's how big they were. And that really dropped down to where it is now, which is around 6% or so. And when Joe Bossano arrived, Joe is always an interesting person, and he talks a lot. It's not always very easy to interview him. And he's done some, in my view, he's done some things extremely well, and then there's some things that I actually disagree with him quite strongly. But no one else would have picked up at that time on the need to really create an economy that could then, in the long term and in the medium term, put us onto a sound footing in terms of being fairly independent. And people sort of questioned the fact that he was spending money on infrastructure, the fact that they were reclaiming land and all those things. And then he also was the one who used to talk about Gibraltar as a country. It's difficult now, after so many national days, to think that there was a time, and the opposition then, I have to say, used to laugh whenever he said my country and this sort of thing. Although several years later, if you jump forward, some of you may remember a national day when Sir Peter Caruana actually held up the Oxford Dictionary on the stage in Casemates and read the definition of a nation. So, some things change even though there's opposition to them at the beginning. And I think, that whole investment in infrastructure, it was critical to us. But the event that changed Gibraltar then was definitely the IRA incident. I think, the rest of it was part of a major political process. It was very important. We were definitely seeing the beginning of a resistance to the colonial attitude. But I remember waking up, it was a lovely day, a Sunday. I had just finished painting. It was lunchtime. I was painting one of the bedrooms or something, and I had a pint of beer, and I think it was a bacon sandwich. I was about to lift up the pint, the phone rang. No mobile phones in those days. I ran down to where the shooting was. They'd just taken Sean Savage's body away. The blood was still streaking down. There was a chalk mark of him. So no one knew what was really going on. I rushed then. I ran to the police station, because obviously I couldn't phone it, only to get in when the soldiers were being piled in and handing in their Brownings to the police station. They were all in jeans and so forth. They looked like soldiers. I mean, Gibraltarians, certainly in those days, could smell a soldier a mile away because you just recognize them. And that scene was a result of a very structured, what became the death, shoot-to-kill debate. And there were things that we knew and subsequently knew about. And so one of them was the question of, there was some tickets in the car that was found in Spain that would have led to the bomb that they had to spend so much time searching for. There was Spanish cooperation. I actually signed an affidavit for the Death on the Rock program. I spoke to the guy in Spain who told me very clearly that the Spaniards had monitored the terrorists right up to the gates. The British government did not want it to look as if it was actually as structured as it was. And in all that, they were expecting, after the shootings, they were expecting a very quick and fast disposal of the bodies to be sent back to the UK. And they thought the coroner would just sign away and send these bodies back. And to give you a sense of the sort of things that went on, that in the inquest, people might remember that the clothes had been taken off the bodies without any real sort of proper ability to do the proper forensic examination. In fact, I was reliably told that one of the male and female bodies had been put into the same drawer naked, as a sense of the resentment that the British soldiers felt towards IRA terrorists, and they were terrorists. We in Gib, the mood at the time was to sort of say, this is terrible, we were all scared. Every time a dog sniffed a car, you'd see people running away. I mean, there was quite a lot of tension at the time. But we wanted to say this was nothing really to do with us. This is something to do with the English. That wasn't the case for Felix Pisarello, who was the coroner. Now, he was heard at one stage because he decided that he was going to have an inquest, a proper inquest. And the British government did not want that at all. He was heard, and we'll come to later how he might have been heard, in his private office, saying that if certain circumstances were shown to be the case, this would be murder. That set off a huge operation to discredit him. And some of you might not remember, but the Sun, which doesn't normally take up foreign affairs or places like Gibraltar, actually had a very short, pithy editorial called Felix the Fool. And that was a complete attack on Felix Pisarello. He stood his ground, and he kept going until the whole month-long inquest with huge amount of pressure to really basically have him reduce the inquest to a farce. And in my view, and I've said it to him myself in the past, I really do think that he stood up against colonialism, because real colonialism is our relationship with the UK. It's nothing to do with the Spaniards. At the end of the day, that's a different sort of pressure. But real colonialism is the ability for you to stand up and resist the sort of pressures that maybe we now take for granted don't exist, and which don't exist because of a succession of people, right, going back, as we know, to World War II, but certainly in 1988, really cracking with strong characters like Joe Bossano, because I think no one really else would have really broken away from what was that sort of very strong colonial attitude. But actually what Felix went through, and went through on his own, was tremendous. And I remember when Julian Mannion, who was the IRA program, the producer of Death on the Rock, I'd found out some information. Actually, it was one of the sort of pivotal moments when, through people I know, they'd seen the pictures of the autopsy, and we knew that one of the bodies was riddled with bullets. I called Julian and said to him to come down to the house because he was staying at the Rock Hotel, and he said, well, speak to me on the phone. And I said, I can't speak to you on the phone. The phones are definitely bugged. And he didn't believe me. When he came down, he didn't believe how many bullets. When we got to the actual inquest, it was quite shocking, the number of bullets that had been pumped into these terrorists. Now, what subsequently came out, and therefore you don't always win when you fight colonialism, was the fact that, and this emerged, curiously enough, in a case that never finished, which was the case that involves the deputy, then Deputy Commissioner Mario Pagas. It was an interesting case where within that, I was told by one of the people dealing with the evidence that had the case gone through, one of the things that he was going to say was that in fact the courtroom was bugged. Now, if you think back at where somebody had heard this word murder, and I got that from a very senior journalist who had very good contacts into the intelligence services, you can think that maybe even other parts of the court complex had been bugged. But it made sense, because obviously the soldiers would then know what evidence they were going to give and what was being said, and remember that they were behind a curtain, so the public didn't see them. It gets actually slightly worse, because quite some years later, I was actually able to meet M, which was the letter given to her. It wasn't like James Bond. She wasn't stroking a cat. And she actually suggested to me that quite a few of the soldiers who gave evidence in the court weren't actually the same soldiers that had been in Gibraltar in March. So, you know, you can recognize why that was such a big event. It had nothing to do with Gibraltar to some extent. It had a lot to do with the democracy debate that came afterwards, the closure of Thames Television as a result of showing that program, the intimidation of a lot of witnesses through different means, not least because none of us really want to be witnesses in a case where there are terrorists involved. But I think most of all, you know, there was one man who stood up to them. And a lot of people were critical of him. A lot of people thought, yeah, they should have taken them away. We should have got rid of them. It's nothing to do with us. But I think, you know, those values which we're always trying to fight for and which make us different to our neighbors, and I go back to my remark about Garcia Margallo, is that actually we're prepared to you know, go through the process and do the thing properly. And that actually takes quite a lot of courage. And, you know, just to finish off in the last minute that I've got, I would say that, you know, when it comes to saying things, look, chief ministers, we've got to remember that if we criticize their levels of democracy, we also have to be ready to entertain those people if they want to talk in Gibraltar. I've certainly had fairly aggressive calls from chief ministers when I've done interviews with Spanish foreign ministers and they haven't liked them. But that resentment has only lasted a lifetime. Thank you.